All right, everybody. So, of course, we have more news as far as Anderson Silva is concerned. Since we last spoke about this, we had the UFC releasing Silva, and Bellator. I believe Scott Coker said at a fight the next day or later on in the week or whatever that he was not interested in signing Silva. But since then we've had a lot of movement on that. Uh, One championship CEO, Chachi Sitchitong, said the same thing. He had no interest in signing Silva. Surprisingly, BKFC said they had no interest. PFL jumping on that train as well. But I woke up this morning to find that RIZIN's head, Sakakibara, yes, pronunciation, he has put out a statement saying that he is interested in letting Silva fight for his promotion. Fellas, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here as far as where the home for perhaps the greatest fighter of all time will be next. And we've said this before, like what happens next with Anderson Silva, but now we've had more activity. Has your stance changed on what happens next with Anderson Silva?
Well, for me, it hasn't, because in our recent video that we did when we talked about him being released and Bellator not being interested, I was saying I'm rocking with Anderson now on whatever he wants to do, because apparently his family, like the arguments that he used to have with his family about being done with fighting, apparently that's gone and over with. Apparently the family has just checked out. They're like, well, you're gonna fight, like you're the man in the house, you can do whatever you want, sort of thing. It seems like that's what's going on. I don't know. Maybe the kids are older now and maybe they're just not as concerned with having dad at home as much. I don't know for sure, but that's what it looks like on the outside looking in. But for me, he's going to want to fight and he's going to find a way to do it regardless. So all of these promotions that are saying that they're not interested, I don't believe them, and I don't believe that they wouldn't jump at the opportunity if it made sense for them financially to do so.
Pat, looks like you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because Silva didn't look especially great against Uriah Hall, but he didn't look terrible either, I guess. He looked like he still had his wits about him. I think when it comes down to it, a lot of promotions are passing more based on price, because I'm sure he comes with a fair amount of price. And also, you got to remember, Dana said that, they parted ways. It wasn't, in terms of, if I remember correctly, the language wasn't like we have released him full release. There might be some other things that are going on there in the background that prevent certain things. Who knows? Maybe UFC has the ability to match any offer, any weird stuff like that. Their contracts can get very crazy, especially when you have people who've retired that end up being ambassadors for the sport, right? So who knows exactly what's going on there. In terms of him actually going to fight someplace, I think RIZIN makes the most sense. Thought it always makes the most sense if he was going to continue to fight, because that's closest to his home. That's a place he could have a good retirement fight. Go out like Crow Cop kind of did, have that tournament thing where he's fighting guys that, honestly, I think he's probably still quite a step above in terms of caliber, and be able to win a tournament, win a couple big fights against people, depending on who they match him up with. And he can, right off into the sunset in a promotion that was the most similar to Pride, where he really shined. So I like the interest from RIZIN. I feel like it's the place that makes most sense for him. I don't want to see him box. I don't want to see him go into some of these other leagues where you've got killers up and coming, where it's like, where do you put him, right? And that's not to say RIZIN doesn't have up and coming fighters as well. I think they're building their brand. I think they're doing great. But especially at middleweight, I think they've got an opportunity there where they could put Silva in against some people and Silva could still compete at a very high level.
Yeah, from initially, RIZIN was what I thought would be the best place for him as well, for the same reasons that you said. His history in Pride, the level of matchmaking that can happen, their willingness to kind of put on, dare I say, like circus style fights, and he can have some one-off against some retired pro wrestler or something like that, and we all would just appreciate it for what it was. So I think that's a good place for him. But as far as the other promotions turning him down, now definitely finances I think are the main consideration there, because I find it very, very hard to believe that Bellator, PFL, One Championship, and BKFC are not interested at all in signing him. I can see scenarios where they may not feel they can afford him, or they want to play hardball at the negotiating table to lower the price. But to say that they don't want him to fight because they're concerned for him just sounds like an absolute joke to me. As evidence, let's look at Bellator's history. For starters, Bellator just got fresh off of a booking of Melvin Manhoef versus Corey Anderson, one of the worst mismatches that you can imagine in the modern era. They also have made a considerable amount of money as far as like booking legends in fights that should have happened 15 years ago. You know, they've trotted out the ghost of Fedor how many times? And then let's take a look at one championship. Now, I know we on Body Lock have been very critical of the way they operate, and my time at Sherdog very critical of them as well. And I will continue being critical because there's no way you can say that you're concerned about Anderson Silva being past his prime and all that stuff and not signing him when you have Vitor Belfort on the roster, who in his late UFC run looked absolutely washed and just totally listless for most of it. But you brought him on, so it's all good. Doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, you pretend to drug test and you pretend to weigh in people, but you're concerned about fighter safety. Sorry, those two things just don't coincide. PFL definitely seems more like a straight financial thing. I mean, they are struggling to maintain the roster that they have. They're having to let fighters fight outside of the promotion if they decided to shut down operations until 2021. So to bring a high profile name like Anderson Silva on board just seems like a bad idea when you're probably strapped for cash. You're probably trying to figure out how to stay afloat. Keep in mind, they had a big signing with Rory McDonald, and God knows what mountains they've had to move to keep him in place and silent about whatever sort of anticipation he has to fight. Then BKFC. Need I say more? BKFC has proven itself repeatedly to be one of the most ghoulish organizations in all of combat sports. They've signed Vanderlei Silva after he went public with having severe CTE issues, and even Bellator wouldn't book him for another fight. BKFC happily stepped up and opened the door for him. Keep in mind too, we also saw the continued executions of Bigfoot Silva and under their banner as well. So please tell me where fighter safety is the concern with Anderson Silva and not money. And as you said, Pat, Anderson, I think in that Uriah Hall fight, he definitely didn't look as good as he's always looked. Of course not. That would be a ludicrous statement, but he damn sure didn't look like he was totally out of it. In fact, I had him winning that fight until, he got dropped in the third round and then the finish in the fourth. So it's kind of, we're playing a money game here. We're not playing a game of who cares about Anderson Silva the most, because I think time and history has shown that that's not the main concern of a fight promoter.
No, I think the difference, what you said is, you mentioned the Ghost of Fedor being in Bellator. I forgot that the Ghost of Fedor fought Hampage Snackson a year ago. And the difference between that and what we have now is they were able to sell tickets for those fights. We don't know what the outlook is in the very near future for arenas, filling up arenas and selling tickets. So all of these promotions saying they're not interested in Anderson Silva, I think that's the main reason. I can't fill an arena for certain right now due to COVID. So we're going to say we're not interested in Anderson Silva. We're not making any money. Like, those are not really those are not pay-per-view organizations we're talking about. We're talking about organizations where you can literally tune in to Paramount TV and watch Bellator, or you can, have your little subscriptions or whatever have you, your one-time buys like on RIZIN or whatever the case may be. That, yeah, they can do those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, can I fill an arena? And I think that's why RIZIN is interested, because they can do that. They can fill an arena. We saw it recently, right? It's a little bit different situation over in Japan than it is over in the States, for example. So I think that's the main reason. I can't look at potential gate for Anderson Silva. Now, I will say, you know, as we were talking about, you mentioned a lot of matchups there that were really fun and kind of weird and, you know, past their prime matchups and all that stuff. Since RIZIN seems to be interested, you know, the connection to Pride there as well with Sakakibara. I don't know if I said that right. If, you know, the connection to Pride there. I don't know what Rio Chonin looks like now in 2020 and 2021. Run back Anderson Silva, Rio Chonin, if he's in any sort of shape to fight. I mean, he's 40, he's like 45 years old now, I think. So if he's in any sort of fight shape, run that back. Let's see if Anderson Silva can avenge his loss at their grandfathered age.
That actually, I'm not mad at that idea at all. I've got another idea I'm gonna toss out at you. Perhaps in between sniffs of the same cocaine that makes him think he can beat Triple G, maybe Oscar De La Hoya decides that Golden Boy MMA 2 needs to happen, and we need Anderson Silva versus Tito, or we need Anderson Silva versus the Ghost of Dan Henderson. There are so many different things that can happen here. Also, I mean, this is another crazy one as well. I don't know if he's still thinking this. When I spoke with him sometime last year, he said he kind of floated this idea. Rashad Evans, since he has turned vegan, though he's lost some weight and he's, you know, saying how healthy he feels and he's still training. We wanted a Rashad Evans versus Anderson Silva fight for a long time. I would not be surprised to see Rashad decide to step back in for a middleweight fight against Anderson Silva. I mean, that it's as terrible as that can be. I mean, all of these matchups sound potentially awful when we think about morals and the price of our souls, but that's not the worst thing that could happen in the world. I guess. I mean, there are options, and I think a lot of them can make some money, and of course, not having a live gate prevents some promotions from making money, but RIZIN would be the place where tickets can be sold. So something's going to happen. I'm willing to bet.
Well, and so just to touch a little bit more on the money thing before I get to my crazy dream matchup, which I think would be the best matchup you could do for business, although morally kind of, yeah, but I'll get to that in a second. Before I do, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe. Let us know your thoughts on where you want to see Anderson Silva, if it makes sense in RIZIN, if, you know, who you want to see him fight against, if he's going to fight again. So just quickly on the business side, I think you guys brought up really great points. Another thing to remember is Bellator, right? With Viacom and CBS merging, you got to remember Scott Coker's under Steven Espinoza now. You've seen a lot of those older guys, Roy Nelson, Frank Mir, all those guys get released from Bellator. My guess is they're going with a totally different direction. So I think that's part of why they turned Silva down. But I also think that, you know, it wouldn't be beyond them in normal circumstances. And another thing that I forgot about until just now is Chadri Sitridong recently said in an interview that one aims to be profitable November of 2021. But he's still admitting right now they're operating at a loss. So you're operating at a loss. You've already signed Vitor. You've signed some bigger names, Eddie Alvarez, all these guys already. You can't really afford to sign Anderson Silva unless he's going to really move the needle there. So I think that's a huge part too. At BKFC, again, newer thing in town. They needed that gate revenue. When Dave Feldman was on the Fight Business podcast, he talked about opening it up to fans again. It's clear that they need that gate revenue, and that's a huge part of it too. So I love those points. I think you guys nailed all that. Now, on to the matchup. Now, this is going to sound crazy, but this to me, and it sucks because I'm hoping that and maybe this is just terrible for me to say, but I'm hoping that if the relaxed testing, right, that may occur in RIZIN, maybe that brings back some old Anderson Silva to life. But could you imagine 2021 Anderson Silva versus Georges St. Pierre in RIZIN Fight Championship? What do you guys think about that? Because that's gonna sell. That's gonna sell all day if you make it a pay-per-view.
That would sell, but I wonder what the status of Georges St. Pierre's UFC contract is. Because when he came back to fight Michael Bisping, at least the deal that was publicized, God knows what that contract really said, but he was supposed to defend the middleweight title if he beat Bisping against Robert Whitaker, and then he retires or takes another sabbatical or whatever, and they move on with the division. So I'm willing to bet that there's at least one other fight on a contract that's just kind of floating out there. And this effort to make this Khabib fight, or lack thereof, or whatever, it gives more evidence to it that there is some sheet of paper saying that Georges St-Pierre owes them at least one more fight, should he decide to compete again. If that's the case, we will never see anything like that anywhere but the UFC. If they can make that happen, I believe that Dana White, after the next UFC fight night, he gets on that podium and he walks back everything he said about Silva. Silva is just, he feels better than ever. Oh, he's ready to get back in there, and this is just the right fight to make at this time, and he will turn into full-on carnival barker to make that fight happen, because that is still a viable way for the UFC to rake in some green. But that happening in RIZIN, over Dana's dead body. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, that'd be a hard sell for two of the biggest UFC stars, or at least stars with the UFC brand attached to them, for their, the height of their careers, to just end up in RIZIN. That would be wild. That would be wild.
But if GSP doesn't, if he's really free and clear of the UFC, I think it would make a lot of sense. I mean, RIZIN would have the juice in Japan, and they would also have the willingness to promote in a different sort of way. Keep in mind, when GSP was trying to come back, the Reebok deal was going to torpedo those plans because of his deal with Under Armour. RIZIN would be open to having Under Armour be a promotional partner for that event. They would do something like that, to where all the fighters would be wearing something made by Under Armour. Under Armour logo will be on the ring or on the cage. There would be something done to appease that. Keep in mind too that Fedor with M1 was always able to sneak that M1 logo somewhere and get co-promotion status, like he did in Strikeforce. So if GSP is free and clear, we could see that. I could believe that being a possibility. Of course, the X factor would be does GSP feel challenged by that? Does he feel like that's a fight that intrigues him? Because at this point, from a competitive standpoint, I don't think he is into that anymore. Someone who just recently held the middleweight title, fighting someone who clearly is not, championship caliber in the UFC's middleweight division anymore, just may not, scratch that itch for him like a fight against an undefeated Khabib Nurmagomedov would.
Well, and yeah, that's great points. And I'm thinking more of, exhibition, sparring exhibition, right? Labeling it something, getting around the contract with retired fighters. We've seen McGregor try and angle to do that, right? Charity sparring with Poirier. My guess is he actually called it that because he probably talked to his lawyers and said, hey, what can I call this so that I can still fight and fight Poirier outside of the UFC? And they said, yeah, you can go ahead and promote this. And then you notice after that happens, suddenly, within 2 weeks time frame, suddenly they're getting the match booked in the UFC. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a way, as GSP being retired, to do exhibition type matches or sparring, something that there's a way around that they could do in RIZIN, right? We've seen Floyd Mayweather versus Tenshin. I'm not gonna even try say his last name. You all know the Tenshin.
Nasukawa.
Nasukawa.
Yeah, Nasukawa. There we go. And that was an exhibition match as well. I think there are ways around this if they wanted to. I know it's a pipe dream. You're right. I'm sure Dana would throw the entire full UFC legal team behind it to not get it done. But we've seen contract disputes before stateside. Kind of seen some people go over to Japan and fight. I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
I mean, but I mean, the point that you make is very good, though. I mean, there's still so many options. There's so many different routes that this can go, and this is without the likelihood that Bellator, One, and BKFC are just lying through their teeth. Like that's still, with them completely taken off the table, that's still something to consider. I think Bellator's tune would change if RIZIN were to offer Anderson Silva and Fedor, and that's the fight that I've kind of expected to happen since. If that offer gets put on the table, if Sakakibara puts that on the table in front of Anderson and Fedor, you think Scott Coker's not going to sign on and say, "Hey, this could be a Bellator co-promoted event"? So this is all about the money. This is not about any sort of respect for a legend. This is not about any sort of concern for his health and his safety. You know, and Matt even said like his family is kind of checked out on that regard as well, apparently. So I can't imagine that these promoters who make a living off of there's pain and suffering suddenly care. You know, I think another thing too, as far as his family, his sons, at least one of his sons, they're fighting now. So their perspective of it is probably totally different. I know one of his sons is a boxer. I think the other one is trying to get into MMA or whatever. So with these guys actually fighting now, they're probably a little more lenient on what dad's getting away with in the household. Maybe they lean on mom, and, you know, Mrs. Silva just lets it happen. The point is, Anderson Silva is definitely not done in combat sports. And I think any sort of illusions that his roadblocks are being put up because they're concerned about him is just laughable, to say the least.
Yeah, and don't discount the fact that there is still a very other intriguing opportunity out there outside of the MMA promotion world, and that is a boxing match against Roy Jones, who apparently, as of time of recording about 10 minutes ago, just spoke on that, saying that if, you know, we are on the eve at the time of this recording of the Mike Tyson Roy Jones matchup. So he just said a few minutes ago, if everything goes well there, that's where he's going to be looking for next. So, you know, MMA promotions, if you're not jumping on the train, apparently, you know, if Mike Tyson doesn't knock Roy Jones into 2035 tomorrow evening, we're going to see Roy Jones Jr. and Anderson Silva in the very near future.